Hey everybody, it's the Tominator, and this time around we're going to be taking a look back at some of the all-time greatest bodybuilding posers. Now, initially this was just supposed to be a top 10, but once I started compiling the list, there were simply too many amazing names to consider, so I decided to extend it to 20, and even then there were some difficult choices to be made. But in the interest of keeping the runtime manageable, it's going to be split up into two parts. So in this first installment, we'll be checking out numbers 20 through 11, with the top 10 coming later in part 2. As I'm sure you're all aware, posing is one of those things that really needs to be judged live or through video as opposed to pictures, because the transitions are just as important as the actual poses themselves, arguably more so. In fact, this is one of the key elements that separates the amateurs from the true masters, that ability to flow seamlessly from one pose into the next. And to that end, we'll be viewing the bodybuilders in action during one of their posing performances, where I'll do my best to explain what exactly makes them such an exceptional poser. But before we get into all that, I want you to keep in mind three things. First, the footage shown here is not meant to be representative of their peak shape physique-wise. We shouldn't really care if a guy is holding water or even a little fat when it comes to judging his presentation skills, as posing and conditioning are two completely separate factors. Nor are we even necessarily looking at their quote-unquote best or most impactful routine. I simply tried to find a sample clip that showcased them posing well and in relatively good resolution. And in some cases, where possible, I sought out rarer footage simply for novelty's sake to hopefully show you something you may not have seen before. Secondly, you'll notice that we're strictly considering individual posing routines. No same old boring mandatory comparison callouts, because while hitting the 7 to 8 compulsory poses effectively is essential to becoming a top bodybuilding champion, that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the art of posing. For example, Dorian Yates was an expert at executing the mandatory shots. He typically dominated in the majority of them, but few would consider him among the all-time greatest posers because his routines were not the most artistic. Not to say that they were bad by any means, because his posing was actually pretty good overall, but Yates simply lacked the grace and creativity of the others we'll see on this list. Third and finally, and this should go without saying, but judging posing ability is extremely subjective. This is perhaps the most subjective element of bodybuilding, even more so than our taste in aesthetics. So ordering this countdown, let alone just narrowing it down to the top 20, was no easy matter. I can't even count the number of times I reordered this damn thing, and hell, if I look back on it in a week, I'll probably change my mind again. So it's far from set in stone, and if it helps then, you can simply choose to view this as my own personal opinion, which of course it is, although I did try to be as objective as possible. Okay, so I had a humorous segment to show you from Vince McMahon's former World Bodybuilding Federation, where Old Man McMahon himself was providing some hilariously over-the-top commentary on Gary Stridham, and it sounded like he was about to bust a nut, but unfortunately it had to be removed due to copyright claim. So instead, let's just jump straight into the honorable mentions, and then we'll dive into this thing for real. Rusty Jeffers is a name some of you may have heard of, though most of you probably haven't, as he is fairly obscure. This guy was famous precisely because of his magnificent posing, which I have to admit is indeed world class. But like all my top 10 or 20 or whatever list videos, I'm really only considering Olympia level contenders here, so he doesn't qualify unfortunately. Likewise for all the classic physique competitors, so don't be asking where's Breon or Bumstead or Ruffin. There's already way too many obscure bodybuilders to consider from the open class, and if we start lumping in the classic physique into the mix as well, it just becomes overwhelming. But as for Jeffers, if it weren't for the fact he never made it to the Olympia, this performance from the 2007 Ironman would have easily been enough for him to secure a top 10 placing on its own, which is why I consider Rusty Jeffers a worthy honorable mention. Lee Priest is another great poser who barely missed the cut. He definitely had some outstanding signature shots and usually put together a very respectable routine. With his massive upper arms and freakishly thick forearms, he was one of the only bodybuilders to ever be able to do justice to Sergio Oliva's victory pose. But the reason he fell just short of my top 20 is because he wasn't always the best at hiding weaknesses. Lee would sometimes hit too many back shots or lat spreads, which were never his strong suits, and that ended up costing him a spot here. It was a really tough call to make, and if I extended the list, he'd probably wind up in 21st, so it was super close. Okay, and my last honorable mentions are reserved for the likes of King Kamali, Fred Smalls, and Daram Charles, pictured here. 3 bodybuilders who put together some dynamic and highly entertaining routines during the 2000s and 2010s. But the reason I decided they shouldn't make it is because their posing styles were somewhat gimmicky and repetitive, relying on pop and lock dancing moves, moonwalks, and robot man maneuvers. So while they were certainly great entertainers, there's no doubt about that, and probably even great dancers, I really don't think their posing was all that exceptional from a purely bodybuilding standpoint. Plus, it's frankly just really hard to compare that type of energetic new wave posing with the more traditional old school style. An example of the latter can be found in this man right here, Charles Clermont, who kicks things off at number 20. This guy was so underappreciated, I tell you, it's really a shame because in his prime, Clermont was damn near on the same level as Flex Wheeler, aesthetically speaking. His posing was also very refined in that classic 80s and early 90s manner. And for the record, I really do believe that the 1980s is where the art of posing reached its true zenith. Don't get me wrong, the 70s were great and the early 90s as well. And of course there's a couple guys holding it down in the 21st century, but artful posing was the norm in the 80s, not the exception. And that's a major reason why this little mini-series has proven so challenging to make because, as I've admitted in the past, I'm not that well versed in pre-1990s bodybuilding, and there's just so many obscure names from back in the day, so needless to say, I'm pretty sure I missed a couple names here or there, but oh well, back to the subject at hand. Though he didn't compete in the IFBB until the 90s, Charles Clermont got his start as a pro in the NABA organization back in the mid-1980s, which explains why, stylistically, he's more reminiscent of a late 80s bodybuilder. Just a beautiful sequence of elegant poses befitting his highly aesthetic physique. Coming in at number 19 is Eduardo Kawak, and this was a last-minute entry that totally caught me off guard. And you might hate me for saying this, but he ended up bumping off the Lion of Lebanon, Samir Bannout. But Kawak was a lesser-known bodybuilder who competed in the IFBB primarily in the late 80s and was highly underrated, in my opinion. This footage seen here is taken from the 1987 Mr. Olympia, and prior to this I had really only heard his name a handful of times in passing, but had never actually seen the man in action. But as soon as I watched his posing routines, I knew he needed to be featured. His smoothness and slow, deliberate motions here, and the way he held poses, are all aspects that recalled the master poser himself, the late, great Ed Corney. So how could Ed Kawak not at least crack the top 20? Truth be told, the main reason he doesn't receive an even higher placement is because I'm not too familiar with the guy, and I've only checked out a couple routines, all of which were excellent, by the way. But I'm not confident in putting him any higher without further evidence, and it's honestly surprising at how little he's mentioned whenever people speak of the all-time great posers. In all my research scouring old internet forums and videos and such, never once did anybody so much as whisper his name. So here today, I'm telling you that Eduardo Kawak was one of the preeminent posers of all time and deserves our recognition. The Sultan of Symmetry, Flex Wheeler, clocks in at number 18. And I know some of you may be scratching your heads thinking, what? Only 18th? Seriously? Well, let me just say that Flex was a spectacular specimen, no doubt. Aesthetically almost peerless back in his heyday here at the 1993 Olympia, and his posing did reveal glimpses of supreme artistry and grace. But at other times he'd stumble or get sloppy resetting between poses, which marks him down in my book. Arnold once noted, and it was at the 1995 Arnold Classic, I believe, where he was doing the commentating, that Flex stumbled a bit at one point during his routine and that it did not look very professional. And since that remark, I've noticed Flex having this tendency for little cracks to slip through in his otherwise polished presentation. Also, for what it's worth, as his career rolled on, his posing style tended to become less choreographed and more impromptu and reaction-seeking, ear cupping for applause and such, for which I had to dock him a bit. Chris Dickerson stands proudly at number 17. And I know a lot of you are probably shaking your heads in disbelief about my putting Dickerson above people like Clermont and Flex, but remember, this isn't about who had the better physique, it's about who was the better poser. And I would argue that Dickerson was slightly superior in that department because he was a little more fluid in his movements and he crafted more cohesive routines with a style that was all his own. Now, granted, possessing a jaw-dropping physique with a world-class back like the Sultan of Symmetry definitely helps make your posing stand out more, and you'll undoubtedly draw more appreciation through still photos. But Dickerson had a very classy, one might even say noble, form of presentation. Perhaps it's a result of the music selection or the fact he often hits shots where it looks like he's grasping a blade, but whatever it is, I just can't help but associate Dickerson's winning performance here at the 1982 Olympia with classic nobility. It's almost like watching a sort of abstract, theatrical interpretation of a medieval knight practicing his sword forms. Another terrific presenter can be seen in the form of Cedric McMillan, who checks in at number 16. This footage, I believe, was from the 2015 Atlantic City Europa Games. And now that Kai Green is out of the picture, it would seem, Cedric is probably the best remaining pro in the open class today, posing-wise. He's put together some pretty memorable routines over the last few years, perhaps most notably during his 2017 Arnold Classic victory, where he attracted the attention and admiration of Arnold Schwarzenegger himself, no easy feat. Cedric likes to pose very slow and deliberately, really taking his time and milking it for the crowd, incorporating a bunch of elaborate shots to highlight his aesthetic physique. He also generally picks atmospheric soundtracks such as this, and it's no secret that dramatic background music always helps enhance the effect of any posing appearance. You may be wondering then why he doesn't rank any higher. The main reason is that Cedric gets an A for effort and ambition, but the hard truth of the matter is that he's not quite as smooth or steady at holding poses as some of the true masters we'll see later. Dennis Wolf lands at number 15, and yes, I firmly believe that the Big Bad Wolf's presentation skills are criminally underrated. Dennis is one of the few guys of the modern era to still pose in that classical fashion, and he does so with gusto. He always chooses appropriately awe-inspiring symphonic scores, like the Avengers theme which he used in his latest 2018 Arnold Classic outing, or this majestic track playing here, which I unfortunately don't know the name of, so if you do, please inform us in the comments below. But this was from the 2007 Mr. Olympia, where he put on a show for the ages. This wasn't his final form per se in terms of condition or raw muscularity, but I'll be damned if it wasn't the most inspiring he ever looked. But what made Dennis so exemplary and such a breath of fresh air when he burst onto the scene in the mid-2000s was that he always kept it old school and classy, incorporating a plethora of twisting shots to accentuate his incredible width, size, and V-taper amidst a series of stately transitions. Dennis Wolf positively exuded superhero-like power and confidence when he posed to music like this, and it was truly a sight to behold. At number 14 is Barry DeMey. Fittingly nicknamed the Flexing Dutchman, DeMey had some terrific routines in the late 1980s, like this one here at the 1988 Mr. Olympia. As a taller bodybuilder, DeMey tended to hit a lot of outstretched shots like the javelin pose to showcase his athletic length and leanness, at a time when bodybuilding was more than just about packing as much mass onto one's frame as humanly possible. He also had some very elegant transitions and was able to hit a variety of poses to highlight his strengths, like that incredible Christmas tree in the lower back, and just his overall pleasing lines and proportions. DeMey definitely had an air of unshakable confidence about him on stage, and this helped solidify his spot as one of the top posers of all time. Vince Taylor was another talented 90s poser who lands at number 13. And this clip was apparently from 1995, although I'm not sure what show. Now, it's true that Taylor was probably a little over-reliant on a RoboCop/Terminator type gimmick throughout his career, but the difference between him and someone like King Kamali is that he introduced that particular innovation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Vince Taylor was the first one to ever do anything like this back in 1991 or so he scores a ton of points for the originality there alone. You could say he was something of a trendsetter then, with his less formal, high-octane approach. And love it or hate it, what's clear is that Vince definitely posed with a lot of passion and emotion. He had a great stage presence with a very high energy level that was infectious and got the crowd going. At number 12, we have totally awesome Lee Haney. When someone mentions Haney, the first thoughts that typically come to mind are that he was an 8-time Mr. Olympia and had a tremendous back. Or maybe you recall that he was the last Olympia champion able to hit a vacuum. Whatever the case may be, usually his posing ability is not the first thing you think of. But the truth is that Lee was an excellent poser who was able to showcase his Herculean body to its full potential. He had an imposing elegance on stage that suited his status as one of the first true mass monsters, yet one who still maintained a trim midsection. Lee would string together a series of powerful poses with sweeping transitions that emphasized his massive upper body and small waist. One could argue that his posing style, as well as his larger-than-life physique, made Haney the perfect successor to Arnold Schwarzenegger. In my eyes, Lee Haney can easily be counted among the world's best when it comes to the art of posing. And the final entrant for part 1 is Kevin Levrone, aka the Maryland Muscle Machine, who lands at number 11. I'm sure many of you expected him to be in the top 10, but please try to reserve judgment until we come to that, then feel free to tell me who he should bump off. But anyway, what made Levrone so special is that, perhaps more so than any other bodybuilder on this list, he was capable of posing in such a variety of different ways. Some routines might be all about showcasing sheer mass and thickness in a flurry of front double biceps, side chests, and hand clasp most musculars, while rocking out to some badass track by Rage Against the Machine. Whereas in other routines, he would pose more gently and gracefully to softer gospel or R&B songs like this one. This performance from the 1997 Finland Grand Prix was easily among his very best, and in terms of the physique itself, it was probably the best he ever looked. But the 1992, 2001, and 2002 Mr. Olympias, plus the 99 British Grand Prix, were all incredible as well, and I encourage you to check those out if you haven't already. As I noted in a previous video, Kevin was really able to combine the best of both worlds, taking the stage by storm as a menacing mass monster in one show, then switching it up with a beautiful, flowing routine at the next. His sheer versatility and ability to establish an emotional connection with the audience is what really puts him over the top, and why I consider Kevin Levrone to be one of the very best posers bodybuilding has to offer. Alright guys, so that's going to do it for this one. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like the video if you enjoyed, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. And stay tuned for part 2, where we'll be counting down the top 10 greatest posers of all time. It's going to be freaking epic, so don't miss out on that one. But until then, I'm the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.